If you can't afford to get into the residential market, it may actually be cheaper for you to buy a commercial property, breaking even or giving you already cash flow while you accumulate for your deposit to buy your dream home or invest into the area you want to. Now, most people think commercial property is complicated, too expensive, it has too much maintenance, but you are wrong. You see what happens, there are properties in commercial that are cheaper in the same area versus residential. Now, let's face it, the housing crisis is getting more severe. Young people can't get into the market. They can't save enough. In fact, you cannot save enough to match the capital gains that's happening in this market. If you're in an area where the capital gains are going up by 10 or 12% per year, you're never going to save enough. Every time you turn around, you're 10, 20% short. No matter how fast you try to save and how many jobs you take on and how much you cut back, it just isn't going to happen. The best way for it to happen is actually for you to get into the property ladder. Doesn't matter whether you're buying residential or commercial, but getting into the property ladder where the property itself is starting to build that capital growth with you as you save up a secondary deposit. Combined in the future, you might sell off that first property or refinance and pull out the equity together. You then can buy your dream home or invest into your dream suburb. Helen, isn't a commercial property really, really expensive? I see out there the big brand names like Dan Murphy's, McDonald's, KFC, the childcare center, the petrol station. They're all multi-million dollars. I can't even afford a property that's $500,000 or $800,000. So how can I buy a commercial property? You see, sometimes it's actually cheaper to buy a little warehouse, a little retail shop, or a little office space in the same suburb than it is to buy the residential in that suburb. So how is that? Well, recently I had two clients come to me because their sons and nephews could not afford to get into the property market. They couldn't get into the property market purely because that it's just too expensive. They couldn't save enough. And they were both earning really good incomes. They were all on $100,000, plus their partners was on 60, 80,000. They were on reasonable good incomes, but they just can't save enough to get into the market because everywhere they turn, every house is $800,000 to $1 million. So their parents and uncles suggested that they come to me because they had such a great success and they buy a commercial property, which helps them save for a deposit to get into a residential property. So that's a really innovative way, out of the box way of thinking. And that's the way you need to think if you want to get into the market. So I want to share with you two examples that I've been helping my clients get into recently. And they're all properties under $500,000. You see, this one here, the first one is a property at $275,000. It's an office space. It's got a brand new lease, a 3-year lease, and it is in Mount Waverley. Now, the average unit in Mount Waverley is somewhere around $500,000 to $600,000. The average house is anywhere from $950,000 to $1.1 million. So if you're a young couple trying to get in, isn't it better to buy a $275,000 office space that's giving you a bit over 6% yield? That is going to not only break even, but give you cash flow in your pocket to help you save for the deposit, plus give you capital growth in the next couple of years. Then it is to buy a residential property where you are totally negative and that you have to shell out your own money and it stops you after you buy the first property. But how does the numbers work? Let's say you're buying this $275,000. Now, how much deposit do you need? You need overall about somewhere around that $80,000 to $100,000 to buy this property. Now, why is that? Let's say you buy this $275,000 and you are borrowing 80% for this property. So you're borrowing 80%, you need to come up with 20% deposit. Now, 20% deposit is around that $55,000, allowing for about 5-6% of stamp duty, which is about $13,750. Melbourne's a little bit more than the other states, so you might bump that up to about $15,000 to allow for that stamp duty. Plus, I add in about $10,000 of miscellaneous costs. So that might be a buyer's agency fee, that might be your legal fees, that might be inspections, application fees for loans, etc., and everything, right? So that's well and truly buffered. It comes into about $80,000. So if you have $100,000, it's a comfortable buy. What does the figures look like and how much are you going to get in return? Are you going to be negative? So you're borrowing about $220,000. So if you're buying this property $275,000, you're borrowing $220,000. Out of the $225,000 right now, if you're borrowing 80% in the commercial space, your interest is going to sit a little bit higher. It's going to be above that 7% mark. You may be about 7 if you can service it. If you can't, it'd probably be a little bit more. So for this exercise, I'm going to calculate that it's going to be around that 7.35% mark, which is quite high in this market. It's probably at the top of that market. I want to give you that so that you're fully prepared. If you get less than that, you're going to get more money in your pocket. If you're not likely to get more than that, because this is what I'm seeing currently with our clients who are struggling to service, who are getting pretty much Your second tier lender is at the top of the market interest rate. So it's always good to have a bit of a buffer. So what that means is that the actual interest rate is going to be about $16,170. So that's exactly how much you need to pay for interest to be able to support this property. Now, remember, this is a commercial property, which means that your tenant pays for all of the outgoings. That means that there's more money in your pocket. The money you get in your pocket is net. And this property here, because it's a little office space with 3-year lease with a really good tenant, it only takes a few months to rent out, so really literally no vacancies in that building. This property is yielding just a bit above 6%, so 6.25% for this property, which means that it brings in about $17,875, right? Now, remember your repayments is $16,170, but you're getting in $17,875 in rent. That means you're actually clearing out $1,700 in positive cash flow. On a small property of $275,000, you're clearing $1,700. So what does that mean to you? It means that this property costs you nothing to hold it, and you're making your money work for you harder. So you're $80,000 or $100,000 now, you're actually moving up in the property line because that property is going to have somewhere between 5 to 7% growth each year, which is going to help you with trying to get to your destination, right? And all along, it's starting to split out in your cash flow already. So, you don't have to find to cut back for another $2,000. You've got an extra $2,000 per year. When the interest rate comes down, you're going to get $5,000, right? So just imagine that it's going to give you probably over about $10,000 over 3 years of holding this property, plus the growth. So your $100K or $80K that you're putting in there is now working really, really hard for you, and it's helping you save for the next deposit. So that's why it's actually cheaper to get into a commercial space than a residential space. In fact, recently I looked at another property here. There's a property in Port Macquarie, right? In Port Macquarie, if you want to buy a house, you're looking at, on the cheap side, $600,000-700,000. On the expensive side, we're seeing properties $9 to $1.2 million around the Port Macquarie. This property in a suburb of Port Macquarie is under $500,000. Same thing applies in the numbers. It's still going to yield over that 6% mark. You're going to see cash flow in your pocket from buying this property. And you can get started. This property probably costs you about maybe less than $150,000, probably around $120,000 to get started if you are just in your starter property and you can't afford to buy into that area. So these are prime examples how it's cheaper to buy a commercial property in the same area as you would have bought a residential property. So if you just want to get into the property game and then you want your money to work harder, then sometimes buying a commercial property is actually then better than buying a residential property, especially when you get it started. Remember, you don't have to keep the property forever. In 3 years' time, you can refinance against the equity against the property, the growth. In commercial, works out exactly the same way as residential. You can refinance against the growth of that property. Or you can sell the property, combine the cash you've got with the deposit you have and buy in the area you choose, right? That is why it's so important to get started. And it doesn't matter whether you buy residential or commercial, because ultimately with all property, it's important to get into the property game, right? So that you can start accumulating wealth. This actually reminds me of when I first started investing commercial. I bought a $360,000 property when I first started in North Sydney in Sydney. Now, I could have bought a residential at that time, probably a 2-bedroom apartment. At that time, it wouldn't be enough to buy a house, but I bought a little retail shop instead because the yield, the return, was better than residential. Now, let's look at that for you. If you were to buy the same property I talked about before, the $275,000 property, and you bought it in Mount Waverley for a commercial property that gave you $1,700 return, if you bought a residential property and you bought the apartment there, and you bought it and it was costing $500,000 to $600,000 in terms of purchase price, and the rents or something like that, it's probably somewhere around $400, maybe $500 at most a week. Which means you're getting about $25,000 in your pocket before expenses and mortgage, right? The mortgage or something like that, we already know if you're borrowing 80%, you're going to be looking at probably borrowing somewhere around $400,000, right? So you're going to be already about $30,000 to $35,000 in repayments in that property, right? About $30,000, $32,000 in repayment, which means that your $25,000, you're going to be short. You're going to be negative about $10,000 to $15,000 after outgoings and everything else, even with your tenant paying you rent. So if you compare that side by side, the $275,000 property, cheaper to get in, easy to get in, you can buy now, and giving you $1,700 of positive cash flow. The $500,000 apartment, you could buy the same area, which are going to be negative $10,000 to $15,000 a year, money out of your own pocket, even with a tenant. Which one will you do better to get you into the next property? Obviously the commercial one, right? So coming back to that, my story of that, buying the first property that was $360,000, I sold it 9 years later because it done its thing. I was consolidating and wanted to go up. I sold it for $1,050,000, so it tripled in price over those 9 years. Plus, I got a cash flow averaged out over those 9 years of $400 a week. So I did better in cash flow than I would in a residential property. I did better in growth than I would in a residential property, and you can too in this current market. So the property right now to buy is a commercial property in the same area you would have buy a residential property rather than the residential property. But the commercial property can help you get into the residential property in the future that you want. If you are new to this game and you don't know how to get started and you're thinking that I really want to get into the property ladder, there's 3 fastest ways to get started. Number 1, buy a commercial property, if not in the area, but in this price bracket you can afford to buy, right? Doesn't matter where it is, as long as it's in the price bracket you can afford to buy that has growth. As long as it's in metro, it has growth, or metro fringe, it has growth, and it suits your purposes of the future, plan 3 years ahead. Buy that property instead of buying a residential property because it's going to get you started on the property ladder. Number 2, going with a friend or a group of friends and buy a property that you would not have been able to afford by yourself. And if that's too hard, you can always join one of our group deals here at Unicorn Commercial Property. And that can help you with the ladder up because it's going to give you value over that time because 3 of your friends come together and buy $1 million property versus one of you buying a $275,000 property. So 3 of you could be in the game together with the idea that later on you would sell that property and each of you could sell the profits. If you can't do that, join one of our group deals. It's the same analogy. Number 3 things to do is to look at properties that no one wants because remember it's your first property. You actually have the servicing to be able to do it. Now in commercial, there's lots of properties that's undervalued that way. Shorter leases, the tenant's been there for a long time, never had the rent go up, the place needs refurbishments, hasn't got the right fit out for it. You could do a simple renovation on a cheap property and get you a leg up. It might not give you a huge 20 or 40% return, but it might give you 10 or 15% increase. If it gives you 10 to 15% increase, you're still doing better. You're in the property game. You are actually moving ahead. You're actually increasing your deposits, which is really important when you're young and starting out. Now, if this video is of interest, spread the word, share it with your friends, make sure everybody can get into a positive cash flow property, which is really important because that's going to help you the next step. If you like it, smash the subscribe button, reach out to us on a free strategy session here at Unicorn Commercial Property and leave us a comment.